J'ouvre maintenant la séance. Welcome to meeting number 129 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on the Status of Women. I would like to remind all members of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name prior to speaking, and a reminder that all comments ought to be addressed through that of the chair. Merci à tous pour votre coopération. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, September 25th, 2024, the committee will continue with its study of gender-based violence and femicides against women, girls, and gender-diverse people. Before we welcome our witnesses, I'd like to provide this trigger warning. We will be discussing experiences related to violence and femicides. This may be triggering to viewers with similar experiences. If indeed any participants feel distressed or need help, please advise the clerk. For all witnesses and for all members of Parliament, it is important to recognize that these are very difficult discussions, so let's try to be as compassionate as we can with our conversations. For today's panel, as individuals, we have Diane Tremblay, artist, we have Alison Irons, and we have Lucas Broadfoot joining us by video conference. Also, from National Family and Survivor Circle, we have Hilda Anderson Piers, Chair. We also have Pakutut, Inuit Women of Canada, Rosemary Cooper, President and Chief Executive Officer, joining us by video conference. And from Regroupement des Maisons pour Femmes Victimes de Violences Conjugales, we have Louise Rendo, co-responsible of political affairs by video conference, and Mathilde True, co-responsible of political affairs, also joining us by video conference. In addition, we have Melanie Omahino, President, Women of the Métis Nation, video conference as well, and Humberto Carollo, Chief Executive Officer with White Ribbon, also by video conference. So at this point, we will begin our statements, up to 5 minutes per organization and 5 minutes per individual. So, Madame Tremblay, la parole est à vous pour 5 minutes.
Ms. Tremblay, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Yes. Wait.
Am I the one speaking? Yes. My apologies. Good morning. My name is Diane Tremblay, and I am a victim and survivor of domestic violence. The reason I am here today is to offer my support, my experience, my vision, and also to express solidarity towards the victims, most of whom are women struggling with violence. I'd like to lend my support to overrepresented Aboriginal women and to women of all origins and genders. These women are being used as human targets by men who vent their anger on them. These power-hungry tormentors are imbued with a hatred for women. As you know, the number of femicides has risen dramatically since the pandemic. We, the victims, deserve immediate resources from qualified organizations, psychological help, money, accommodation, legal assistance from judges during court appearances, and from police forces whose hands are often tied by laws that are made for criminals and not for abused women, as I have seen. I know what it's like, and unfortunately, the lack of resources, staff, budget are not there to help us. We are here today to help find solutions quickly because criminals don't wait. They kill. They kill wives, mothers of families, daughters, grandmothers, aunts, friends, and they don't stand a chance. None at all. Why? Because they are not adequately protected and taken seriously by our Canadian governments and our provinces. This help is lacking for decades now. The women seem to be at the bottom of the list of priorities for our leaders, even in 2024, except you, of course. I myself was a victim of domestic violence, and during this difficult period of my life,
Take the time you need.
During this difficult period of my life, I experienced sexual assaults, 2 attempted murders by my aggressor. and I experienced violence of all kinds, as well as my children. Thank you. Furthermore, I had to fight hard for my safety and for my psychological help. This goes back to 2009. And almost 20 years later, I'm still telling you the same thing. I am begging you for your help and begging for change. This is not normal. It's immoral and it's unacceptable. Here is what I propose as solutions. That in every school in Canada, programs be set up to educate and equip our children so that they know how to communicate and how to manage their anger. We need a mediation program that should be made available to our children with behavioral difficulties. In each and every school, we need to provide these resources, and resources could come from survivors of violence who would receive adequate training in violence management programs and in assistance for child victims, and an immediate gesture that would be restorative for victims from an early age, beneficial for both parties and a gift for their entry into the adult world would be prevention. Because prevention is what is often forgotten. There have to be meetings in each of the provinces, discussions with judges by way of example, as we are doing today, meetings like this one, meetings that could help everyone at least every 2 years with victims so that they are aware of their needs. Of course, it is best that survivors be helped and that it not just be discussions in court. There has to be more human encounters. This could be done with police services and their leaders so that victims are better understood and assisted. It would be a huge step towards helping victims while they are being victimized. Victims who are survivors of violence could bring their expertise to the table. When one is in shock or one is healing, I think it is too early on to be able to provide clear ideas and have a healthy management of one's emotions. So what I'm saying is that police officers don't always know how to act. So if we can provide, say, conferences or meet in a panel such as today's and provide you with our expertise and opinions, it would help police officers understand us better when events like these arise. There is still much education to be done and much understanding to be gained with respect to women victims of violence. There could be discussion panels. There could be public discussions, perhaps once a year. There could be information sessions provided by support workers or survivors, because the safety of women is everyone's business. And to date, reporting is putting oneself in danger. I think that many murderers do not understand the entire repercussions of what they do. All they want to do is control or take revenge. We, women, end up on our knees begging our aggressors to allow us to live, to not hit us, to not perpetrate violence on us. And here we are, kneeling before governments again, begging to be protected, to be in safety. We've been begging for this for decades, and it's going on forever. When will governments do what they need to do now? In conclusion, I think that there could be an ambassador to represent women victims of violence. They could be keeping an eye on follow-ups. They could represent us to governments in all provinces of Canada in order to remind them that we exist, that we have a right to respect, and that we should be allowed to decide our life paths without being under the control of a violent man or under threat with a knife or a gun. We have the right to live safely at home. Thank you for having invited me, listened to me, and best of luck in your future actions.
Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you so much.
At this point, I would like to welcome Ms. Alison Irons. Please go ahead.
Forgive me if my introduction is repetitive from last week when my internet dropped. I'd like to thank the committee for having invited me to speak again today. By way of introduction, and this may be repetitive for some of you, I'm an ex-RCMP officer of 9 years service who attended many so-called domestic disputes during my service, and also at the time was on the board of the North Shore Women's Centre in North Vancouver, BC, as a police advisor. And I'd like to point out that was some 40 years ago, and here we are still. I've also worked as an Ontario government investigator and investigative manager for Ombudsman Ontario, particularly in the field of corrections, and I retired as a director of enterprise-wide services in the Government of Ontario. Further, I'm certified as a Canadian human resources leader. Sadly, I'm also the mother of 26-year-old Lindsay Margaret Wilson, born the 30th of July, 1986, my precious daughter and best friend, who was stalked and shot to death by her ex-intimate partner, a legal gun owner who had guns and a license he never should have been granted, in a murder-suicide on April 5th, 2013, in Bracebridge, Ontario, just 2 weeks before completing her graduating exams. I received her degree at Nipissing University posthumously. I want to emphasize to the committee that my daughter's assassin, and yes, that's what I call him, had never been violent with her until the day he murdered her in cold blood. He was clean-cut, articulate, and from a well-to-do family of professionals in the community in which he lived. He was also manipulative, artful, and controlling with my daughter in a number of ways. He'd tell her she was the love of his life, but would undermine her self-confidence excuse me, by constantly criticizing her looks, her weight when she was slim, not overweight, her clothing choices, etc. She left the relationship twice when she caught him drug dealing behind her back, another manipulation as he was not the person he purported to be. The first time, he lured her back with letters articulating his love for her, his apologies, and the inevitable promises of changed behavior. Occasionally, he threatened suicide by firearm to keep her with him. We must understand that threats of suicide to keep someone in a relationship are a form of coercive control, since they terrify the recipient of the threats. She kept these from me initially and sadly, as she knew how I'd react. He also incessantly held over her head the matter of an $85 phone bill he claimed she owed him. My daughter, a principled person, didn't agree this money was owed, and also strongly believed that since she had unwittingly been duped into paying many of the costs in their relationship, she definitely owed him nothing. Since drug dealing had been his only income, he didn't want to pay for anything in cash. I even offered her to give her the money to pay him so that he would stop harassing her about it, but she refused on principle. In January 2012, he threatened to commit suicide by firearm over 3 hours on the phone with her after she caught him drug dealing again and had broken off the relationship for good. She severed all contact with him. He then kept trying to contact her through blocked number phone calls, through friends, through social media, and letters he wrote to her again, professing undying love, that it was all his fault, but still adding content to undermine her self-esteem. And he continued to bring up the phone bill. She read me the final letter about 3 weeks before her murder. There was no hint in the letter of any threat or of his escalating anger towards her, but I pointed out to her how manipulative, deceptive, and undermining the letter was. In one sentence, he'd praise her. In the next sentence, he'd find fault. We were afraid to get a restraining order because I knew as an ex-police officer that its service on him might be the very thing that tipped him over the edge into violence. I also know that if he showed up, I knew that if he showed up at her door with a gun, it would be too late to get help. We also thought incorrectly at the time that his driver's license was suspended and that he couldn't reach her 5 hours away. But he did drive 5 hours, found her car, and stalked her that week to find her home. He surprised her with a shotgun in the driveway, and while she pled for her life, he shot her with both pellets and slugs at close range, center body mass, a clearly fatal injury. She survived for only about 20 minutes. Police told me she was in shock and in no pain, but that she knew she was dying. Horrific for a mother to learn. I've been lobbying for a criminal coercive control offence since I learned England and Scotland had done this, and have monitored how such cases have been faring in the UK justice system. It's clear that police are indeed laying the charges. In fact, to date, there are over 1,000. However, it's now emerging that too many are failing in court because judges and defence counsel are arguing, but he didn't hit you, did he? So it couldn't have been that bad. It appears they don't understand the legal definition of coercive control as non-violent behaviour of the accused towards the victim. This demands the education of the criminal justice system regarding coercive control as an absolute necessity in implementation of that bill, as was done in Kira's law. Abused women are at greater danger of harm if such charges fail in court because personnel don't understand the intent and meaning of the law. Monitoring of charges and convictions initially must also ensure there's no adverse impact on identifiable groups, such as Indigenous persons or people of colour. Finally, I firmly believe, as an ex-police officer, that a conviction for coercive control in one's criminal history will serve as an evidentiary building block to corroborate any future pattern of behaviour which might progress to violence or, worse, femicide. Thank you for listening and for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony. At this point, I would like to welcome Mr. Broadfoot. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Good morning. Today I stand before you not just as an individual, but as a voice for my sister, Brianna Broadfoot, whose life was tragically cut short by domestic violence this summer. It is a privilege to address you in this esteemed chamber where the issues that shape our nation are discussed and resolved. Brianna was a vibrant spirit full of dreams and aspirations whose potential was extinguished far too soon. Her story is a reminder of the countless individuals affected by the scourge and domestic violence, a pervasive issue that touches every corner of our society. My sister Brianna Broadfoot. Brianna's story is not just her own. It is a reflection of countless lives disrupted and destroyed by domestic violence. My sister's abuser was let out on bail after an incident in March. My sister was strangled and beaten until she didn't look the same. I was the one that had to go get her from the bus stop, and I'm the one that called the police. He was let out the same day after just getting his fingerprints done. He also had a heavy record of violent crimes. He was charged with strangulation with intent to kill. At our last discussion, it was disheartening to hear the response from the Liberal Party, where domestic violence was dismissed as a non-issue. This response was not just disappointing, it was a stark reminder of how domestic violence continues to be marginalized, despite its devastating impact on families and communities across Canada. Domestic violence is not a distant concern or an abstract issue. It is a crisis that affects real people, our friends, our family, our neighbors. Yet the reality remains that criminals and abusers continue to roam our streets, often without facing the accountability they so clearly deserve. This lack of consequence emboldens offenders and leaves survivors feeling isolated and unprotected. It is clear that we need to address this issue with greater urgency and commitment. One crucial step forward is the implementation of comprehensive domestic violence education in our schools. By integrating domestic violence awareness and prevention programs into the curriculum, we can foster a generation that understands the signs of abuse, knows how to help and where to seek help, and stands firmly against violence in all its forms. Educating our youth about the dynamics of domestic violence will not only empower them to protect themselves, but will also help cultivate a culture of empathy, understanding, and respect. Furthermore, it is imperative that we enhance support systems for survivors and ensure that justice is not just a theoretical ideal, but a practical reality. We must work towards creating a robust legal framework that holds abusers accountable and ensures that survivors receive the protection and support they need. This includes addressing the gaps in our legal system and ensuring that those who commit acts of domestic violence and violent crimes are not left to continue their harmful behavior unchallenged. My sister's memory calls us to action. It is a fight. It is a call to fight against the normalization of violence and to demand better for all who suffer in silence. Let us honor her and all of the other countless victims by taking decisive steps to address domestic violence, both through education and reform. Let us work together to create a society where everyone, regardless of their circumstances, can live free from fear and harm. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas, for your sensitive testimony. You were extraordinarily brave. At this point, I would like to welcome Ms. Anderson-Pierce. You have the floor for up to 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Hilda Anderson, and I am the chair of the National Family and Survivors Circle, which is made up of families who are impacted by missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and survivors of gender and race-based violence. Thank you for this opportunity to address the ongoing crisis of gender-based violence and femicides in Canada, especially as it impacts Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people. This is a human rights crisis, a Canadian genocide, as the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls identified, rooted in systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and severe social and economic marginalization. Let me be clear, Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people are not statistics. They are individual human beings with inherent rights. Right to safety, dignity, self-determination. Addressing this crisis is not a partisan issue. It is a human rights obligation that demands unwavering cross-party commitment. The solutions must outlast political cycles and be backed by sustained concrete action and the political will to see this through. The National Family and Survivors Circle is guided by 4 pillars: inclusion, interconnectedness, accountability, and impact, which I urge must shape Canada's response. Today, I present 3 key actions that are essential to ending this violence. First, we need rigorous accountability mechanisms backed by political will. Policies without accountability risk becoming hollow gestures. Canada must establish a national accountability framework with legislatively mandated impact assessments, timelines, and progress indicators to measure and track effectiveness. Annual public reporting that provides clear, measurable data on progress, funding allocations, and outcomes specifically for Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people, with feedback from Indigenous community on what is truly working. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has issued recommendations to Canada on addressing gender-based violence. These are urgent and necessary guidelines. The 231 calls for justice, however, are legal imperatives that are not optional. Canada has a binding responsibility to uphold these calls and ensure they lead to meaningful change. Embedding accountability in legislation is the only way to ensure these obligations are upheld permanently and not subject to shifting priorities. Second, equitable funding must prioritize Indigenous-led initiatives. To make a real difference, sustained and equitable funding must be directed to Indigenous-led organizations where Indigenous women, girls, and gender-diverse people hold decision-making roles. I urge this committee to support legislated commitments for sustained equitable funding focused on Indigenous-led initiatives, ensuring that solutions are created and guided by those with lived experience. predictable multi-year funding models to allow Indigenous organizations to plan, grow, and provide stable, culturally relevant services for their communities. Equitable funding acknowledges the right of Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people to lead in addressing the challenges they uniquely face. Third, Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people must be leaders in policy decisions on gender-based violence. The 4 pillars of inclusion, interconnectedness, accountability, and impact mean that Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people must be at the helm of designing, implementing, and overseeing policies that affect them. This includes mandating their leadership in policy-making bodies as essential partners whose expertise and experiences are invaluable, centering their voices in policy planning and strategy, ensuring that solutions are rooted in their cultures, values, and realities. Finally, we must legislate trauma-informed, culturally safe services that are guided by Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. This requires legislated standards for trauma-informed and culturally safe support to guarantee respectful, effective services that respond to the unique needs of survivors. It also involves education and awareness programs led by Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people to increase public understanding of the colonial and systemic roots of gender-based violence. In conclusion, this committee's study on gender-based violence and femicide is a vulnerability for Canadians to take definitive, lasting action. The National Family and Survivors Circle is calling for nothing less than an end to femicide, a commitment to a future where Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people live in safety, security, and dignity. This is not a goal. It is our responsibility to uphold their rights, to live free from violence and discrimination. I urge each of you to champion these actions and recommendations, ensuring this work is sustained beyond political cycles and remains a legacy of justice that transcends partisanship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson-Pierce. Next, we would welcome Ms. Cooper. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
You hear me all right?
I can.
Okay. Good afternoon, rather good morning, Madam Chair, committee members, guests, and staff. Udlako Chair, my name is Rosemary Cooper, and I'm the CEO and Paututit Inuit Women of Canada. Paututit is a national representative organization of Inuit women, girls, and gender diverse Inuit in Canada. We advocate for their needs, health, violence, abuse prevention, justice, social and economic development, equity, and self-determination. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on femicide, specifically as it impacts Indigenous women and gender diverse people in Canada. You may be expecting Paututit Inuit Women of Canada to focus solely on Inuit women and described in our experiences, the trauma we continue to face, and the statistics of violence against us. But we've done this for decades and have found that knowing how and why Inuit women are targeted isn't enough. Across the Americas, femicide has long been used as a term to describe the targets of politicized killing of women and girls by institutions and states, including forced disappearances. It is important to make these links between, because we are talking about purposeful, instrumental targeting of women and gender diverse people because of who they are. Following the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, the government of Canada accepted the finding of genocide. And it is this intersection we want to focus on today. We often hear calls to listen to Inuit women, but are Inuit women actually being heard? Today, we need to focus on the other side of this conversation. Their inaction and the lack of priority and investment to end this violence and end the systems that allow this violence to continue without adequate intervention, prioritization, or accountability for those responsible. The National Inquiry into MMIWG offered valuable findings, but it didn't provide sufficient data to give a full picture of the violence Inuit women face. Key data held by the RCMP remains unreleased, restricting our understanding of the true scope of this violence. We demand that this data be released to national Indigenous women organizations immediately. The government has accepted the inquiry's findings of genocide, but acknowledging this genocide must be matched by concrete action. The sixth convening of the Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women and Girls recently held in Mexico. Our board chair, Nancy Ituk, and all our Indigenous women continue to raise the issue of inaction of government in Canada, Mexico, and United States. When we talk about femicide and the violence against Indigenous women and Inuit women, we must acknowledge that this violence is political. As Inuit women, we live the personal as political. Every day in an ongoing settler colony. At the intersection of colonialism and patriarchy, where men are typically hold the authority and privilege, Indigenous women are targeted not by chance, but because erasing us strengthens settler power. This is not accidental. Violence, the systems we live within, were built on the dehumanization of Indigenous women. Ending this violence demands the same intention that went into creating these systems. We've seen the major commitments on paper, but let's talk about the actual investment. The National Inquiry into MMIWG was originally funded at $53.8 million, with a then later investment bringing it to $92 million. Yet in the same year, $2.6 billion went toward innovation and research. MMIWG essentially received in 3.5% of the investment in the innovation budget. Since 2021, Canada has allocated $29.5 billion in investment for small businesses, in green economy, and AI startups, while Indigenous communities receive $2.2 billion in broadly spread funding that didn't directly address MMIWG crisis. In the same period, Madam Chair, only $125 million was direct to MMIWG specific initiatives, and only 2 out of the 231 calls for justice have been fully implemented. This disparity reflects the significant gap between the commitment to economic development and the urgent need for targeted action to address violence against Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse people. So what is our priority? What message are we sending to Indigenous and Inuit women, girls, and gender diverse people and to those who perpetuate this violence? By these numbers, we're saying this is not a crisis. This isn't genocide. it's business as usual. We
Miss
continue
Miss
to add our
Cooper, Miss
voices.
Cooper, if I could
Yes.
kindly ask you to finish your thoughts. We're about 2 minutes over, so if you could just
Okay.
wrap up, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chair. In closing, there are costs that can be immediately implemented now with the real investment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. At this point, we have Madame Rondeau with Ms. True for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Bonjour,
Good morning, Madam Chair and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for the invitation for us to appear this morning. Our association includes 46 assistance centres and shelters for women victims of domestic violence throughout Quebec. To date, in Quebec, there have been 20 femicides since the beginning of the year, including 12 in a domestic context. Domestic violence, which is also called coercive control, is a social problem that is part of the history of unequal relationships between men and women. These are relationships of domination that are deeply rooted within men and that lead to domestic violence and ultimately to femicides. Fortunately, there are potential solutions to fight against violence against women, and here are a few. First, training in Canada as elsewhere. It is often at the hands of a partner, whether that's a current or former partner, that women die from being murdered. Contrary to what one may think, femicides in a domestic context are some of the most predictable murders. Contrary to popular thinking, it is not necessarily preceded by physical violence. However, coercive control is always present and is at the heart of the process of violence. Monitoring via technology, harassment, isolation, jealousy, threats, etc. These are all demonstrations of coercive control that go beyond a breakup and that are significant precursors to femicide. There has to be proper risk assessment that would allow a safety net before femicide happens. It is absolutely essential that socio-legal stakeholders and that providers of health services and social services who are often working on the front lines with women and children who are victims of violence be adequately trained and be given the tools that they need to be able to assess these risks. In order to be able to do that, governments have to provide financial resources so that they can be trained. As well, it would be useful that the government take stock of the various existing tools and practices to assess domestic violence risk and learn from best practices in that area. Criminalization of coercive control. There has to be better protection of women and girls, and that would happen through the adoption of Bill C-332 that would criminalize coercive control. It would send a strong message to victims that there are many forms of violence and there is more subtle violence through control, and it is just as devastating, but these will be taken into account by the legal system. This would also speed up training of those stakeholders who are helping women who are victims of domestic violence. If the bill is passed, police will have to document coercive control, and prosecutors will be able to take it into account throughout the prosecution. So we therefore urge the Senate and the government to pass Bill C-332, and I'll hand it over to my colleague. Thank you. However, this prevention of femicides cannot happen without specialized resources for domestic violence. And in Quebec, as well as in other provinces and territories, shelters are full and many are having a very difficult time meeting the needs of women. Sometimes women have to wait several weeks before they can have access to these services. Shelters often have to turn down requests to help with awareness raisings within their community, including schools, and yet it is so important to raise awareness amongst those young people. The federal government also has a role to play. It has to make sure that centers and shelters have enough funds to be able to carry out its mission. These funds could be distributed under Pillars 1 and 2 of the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. There is funding under those two pillars, but it is not enough. Furthermore, Canada needs a solid network of centres to assist women and to shelter them within second stage shelters. There also has to be better awareness raising, because awareness raising also raises awareness among the population, and it also raises awareness amongst victims and their families. I must also remind you of the importance of people having access to adequate housing. Currently, 3 women out of 4 who have been victims of violence cannot find housing. It is impossible to find affordable housing, and that is often the cause of the fact that women stay longer in shelters, and therefore we cannot meet the demands of other women. It is very important to act, because housing is also a safety issue for these women. In conclusion, we hope that our meeting with you will lead to better understanding of the underlying causes of femicides and violence against women, and that it will help you take necessary measures to make sure that we can change in a sustainable way mentalities and behaviors in order to better protect women and children in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much for you both for your testimony. At this point, I'd like to welcome Ms. Omenyu. You have 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving La Femme Chifo to Pimsawak the time to speak to the committee today on this topic of gender-based violence and femicide against women, girls, and gender-diverse kin. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 territory and the motherland of the Métis Nation. LFMO is the National Indigenous Women's Organization whose mandate is to represent Métis women from across the Métis motherland. We advocate nationally and internationally for equal treatment, health, and well-being of all Métis people, with a focus on the rights and needs and priorities of Métis women, youth, children, and to us LGBTQIA+ Métis kin. Data shows women and girls experiencing oppression based on race, ethnicity, age, religion, ability, region, and gender identity and sexual orientation are disproportionately targeted. Métis women and girls are especially vulnerable. Nearly 4 in 10 cases involving a marginalized Métis women or girls are often impacted by mental health struggles, substance abuse, poverty, homelessness, the street economies, histories of violence, intergenerational trauma, and/or previous child welfare involvement. Perpetrators exploit inequity and oppressive conditions targeting marginalized women and girls. We have some recommendations to end femicide, intimate partner violence, and all forms of gender-based violence. The utilization of language that describes the reality of what is occurring is an important first step. Using the term femicide is a step forward. It demonstrates solidarity with Indigenous women in Mexico and Latin America who have long spoken out against gender-based killings amidst systemic corruption and inequity. Canada's adoption of this term will highlight a shift in acknowledging gender-based violence as a systemic issue. It is also an opportunity for government researchers, advocacy and survivor groups, and feminist anti-violence agencies to collaborate with Indigenous women's organizations like LFMO and Puktutit, who have shared an interest in tracking violence and understanding the trends and engaging prevention strategies. Partnerships with Indigenous women's organizations are essential for tracking violence, understanding the trends, and engaging these strategies that are going to help change this. The term vulnerabilization was introduced by an Indigenous sister from Mexico during the 2023 Trilateral Working Group on Violence Against Indigenous Women. It reflects Métis and other Indigenous women and gender-diverse kin's realities in Canada, emphasizing how structural inequalities create conditions for violence. It also shifts focus from individual or community risk to structural factors and enabled risk. The term recognizes that poverty, racism, homophobia, colonialism, and ageism are exploited by perpetrators. Underlines that perpetrators weaponize systemic inequalities to target marginalized groups. Current laws allow Crown Counsel to request judges to detain innocent crime victims for up to 30 days to compel testimony, a practice that can re-traumatize the victims and contribute to a higher risk of violence, self-harm, and suicide. Immediate legislative reform is needed to prevent treating victims as criminals and including practices like incarcerating them alongside their perpetrators. A dedicated network of Métis justice system navigators is crucial for guiding Métis individuals through the legal process, connecting them with trauma-informed, culturally safe supports, and ensuring access to specialized courts like mental health courts. Culturally grounded victim services and transitional supports for youth that are aging out of care are also essential to mitigate the impact of system neglect and to improve life trajectories for Métis people involved in many of these systems. System navigators support Métis women, children, and 2S LGBTQIA+ kin by ensuring programs are developed with a culturally based gender and intersectional framework that addresses unique vulnerabilities such as intersecting identity factors. This approach includes providing age-appropriate, culturally sensitive education and resources on topics such as healthy relationships, safe dating, and gender-based violence. LFM, along with all orders of government, should develop a media campaign to correct the misconceptions about people. This campaign should focus on addressing historical discrimination and systemic factors that increase vulnerabilities for Indigenous women and children, promoting awareness through a strength-based narrative that emphasizes identity, resilience, and pride. We advocate for an allocation of funding for public education campaigns that highlight the unique experiences of women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ kin, emphasizing the impacts of racism, sexism, and colonization. Focus should be given to community-focused implementation of reconciliation activities aimed at reducing racism and building safer, more vibrant communities through fostering understanding and respect for various perspectives and intersectional experiences. One piece that keeps falling on the shoulders of Indigenous women is the concept of us fixing our men and boys. It is not our responsibility to heal the perpetrators who've impacted our lives and to fix non-Indigenous males who've inflicted several harms on us. We strongly recommend it that fixing men becomes a man's issue and not a woman's issue. In closing, we call for the following awareness and action. Use the term femicide. Acknowledge the systemic nature of femicide and its impact on these marginalized communities. Support initiatives that address structural inequalities contributing to gender-based violence and femicide, and commit to fostering collaboration with Indigenous and marginalized communities to advance prevention and protection services. And the one last thing that I'd like to say is thank you to all the witnesses that came here as survivors and family members of victims to be able to tell us their story today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony as well. Our last witness this morning is Mr. Carollo. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Good morning. First of all, it's a real honor to be with all of you today. 99% of perpetrators of sexual violence toward women are girls, and girls are men. Ideological motivated violent extremism now has its own category of gender-based violence, with 75% of profiles belonging to boys and men. Boys that are bullied are overrepresented in misogynistic, hate-fueled mass murders, and research has shown that online communities that promote radical extremism are directly linked to real-life violence. Unchallenged bullying in boys leads to men that assault. 90% of all sextortion victims are boys and young men. My name is Humberto Carollo. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at White Ribbon. I am a member of the Department of National Defense and Canadian Armed Forces External Advisory Group for the Sexual Misconduct and Support and Resource Center. I'm also a member of the Ontario Government Domestic Violence Death Review Committee. I am based in Toronto on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including Anishinaabe, Huron, Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, I'm appearing as the CEO of White Ribbon, a Canadian charitable organization that engages men and boys in the prevention of gender-based violence. It's important to point out the stark realities that exist for men and boys and the impact of those realities on women and girls and gender diverse people. Sadly, we continue to socialize our boys and men to be prone to perpetrate violence and then wonder why our collective efforts aren't reducing the rate and prevalence of gender-based violence. Gender-based violence and femicide are issues of prime importance to me professionally and personally, as I have dedicated my professional life to its eradication. As a boy and young man, I grew up with this violence, watching the women I love experience that violence at home and in my community. I am an adoptive dad of 3 young men who lost their birth family to poverty, addictions, and domestic violence. I stand in solidarity with those of you who've been directly impacted by this violence, and I pledge to support your calls for justice and action. Another way of life for men and boys is possible. White Ribbon's vision of our future is one free of all forms of gender-based violence and discrimination. This isn't a theoretical or idealistic goal, but one that is absolutely achievable within a full-resourced, long-term, multifaceted prevention plan that focuses across the lifespan. Findings from Ontario's Domestic Violence Death Review Committee coroner's inquests have repeatedly shown that gender-based violence is not only predictable, but also preventable. Yet primary prevention is significantly underfunded. And in our 33 plus years of existence, White Ribbon still does not have core funding. Primary prevention saves lives, it heals, it changes people's life paths. It creates new societal expectations of acceptance, nonviolence, and equity. It focuses on the root cause, the unhealthy socialization of men and boys. Gender-based violence is perpetrated almost entirely by men, young men and boys who were taught, enabled, and so many victimized, traumatized, and molded over countless generations to adhere to attitudes, behaviors, and social norms of unhealthy masculinities. These intergenerational life lessons inform how men and boys act in the world and our society's expectations of them. But we can create a better future. A long-term, multifaceted prevention strategy is needed that reaches into our homes to help men accept accountability, to develop the skills in healthy relationships, benefit from fatherhood and role model programming, and offer healing support to boys and young men who have witnessed violence. Our schools to equip them with strength-based positive programming, to foster resilience and capacity in boys and male educators. Our sports to promote healthy masculinities, equity, safety, and respect for women, the fair recognition of women in sports, and to change the deeply entrenched sexist, hypermasculine norms, views, and attitudes. The online toxic ecosystems to inoculate against the harmful influences through building resistance, reducing the person's tendency to support the ideology, and reducing the credibility of deeply misogynistic and hateful influencers. Extensive school resources, parenting education, and social media campaigns are needed. Our workplaces to implement best practices of male allyship, bystander intervention education, training for management and staff, and a holistic approach that supports survivors, enhances policies, and utilizes public education campaigns. Our communities to offer community-based programming that teaches and role models healthy masculinities at each stage of development for boys and young men, and our social norms that help boys and men to increase their emotional IQ, enable them to understand and adhere to equity values, develop strong skills in empathy and compassion, and normalize healthy masculinities. I started this speech with some pretty jarring statistics to demonstrate the gender aspect of who is perpetrating this violence. Primary prevention efforts that focus on changing social norms and men's and boys' attitudes and behaviors are the exact way we change our culture so that gender-based violence stops and is not carried on by the next generation. It's the formula for creating our future free of gender-based violence. Let's confine gender-based violence and femicides to Canada's history and create the world we all desire for ourselves and for generations to come. Thank you very much. Miigwech.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your sensitive opening remarks. At this point, we will begin our round of questions. We do have a rather large panel today, so I would ask all members and witnesses to be very mindful of the time. I will note that the time that I'll be informing members and witnesses when you have 1 minute left, and then when you have 30 seconds remaining. I was a little bit lenient during the opening remarks to make sure that every witness was able to express their thoughts. So just be mindful of that so we can have a robust 2 rounds of some healthy dialogue. Thank you. At this point, I would like to welcome Dominique. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of you for coming, and thank you for having made yourselves available to share your thoughts with us. Ms. Tremblay, welcome. Again. Thank you for having invited me back. Ms. Tremblay, in your opening remarks, you said that legislation is made for the criminals, and I have had to fight for my own safety. So perhaps we could just recall your tragic story. You were a victim for several years of domestic violence. How long? 7 years. And was your spouse at any time at all on bail? Often, yes. Well, perhaps you could remind us of this, because there are people who have said that current legislation allows repeat offenders and violent men to be on the streets and to commit these crimes against their partners. So perhaps you could recall this context where perhaps that spouse should have been in a jail rather than outside. Well, as you know, I'm an artist, I'm a singer, I'm also a conference speaker, I'm a writer. And so I often had to go and travel. And this was once I had left him. But, you know, there were often posters of me, and wherever I traveled, wherever I went to speak, he was there. He was even in the restaurants I went to. So he continued to follow me for a very long time. And when I would call, for example, the police to say that he was there again, the police officers would collect him, take him to the station. He would be given a warning, and then he would be let go. And this happened many, many times. So I had to actually put an end to these career activities. I ended up on social assistance because I really had nothing left to be able to support myself financially. And this happened over and over again. And when I say over and over again, I'm saying up to 7 or 8 times. So he was never kept inside. When it was the weekend, perhaps he was kept there. That was the only time that he was 2 or 3 days inside. So he was often released, perhaps because he had to appear. And if I would tell you that the most he probably did was 2 weeks. He'd get a rap on the knuckles. They would write me and say, listen, Ms. Tremblay, he's done his 3 or 4 therapy sessions. Well, do you want to know how many therapy sessions I did to be able to get out of this? Well, it was like there was a magic wand to cure him. Do you know what I read? About a 1 year after in a newspaper, I read the headlines. It was a woman who had said that she was beaten for 4 hours by the same man. So you're saying you had another victim? Yes. Yes. I had to leave in a taxi I found this woman on Facebook, and I went to see this woman, and I took her by the hand, and I said, "You're not alone anymore. I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you get out of this." And when he saw me, I asked the judge myself to recall past events, because he said before the judge he'd never done any of this before. And for once a judge took my testimony into account. Thank you so much. I hope other colleagues of mine can ask you questions. Ms. Riendo, thank you so much for coming here today. We're so happy to see you. Now, you heard Ms. Tremblay's testimony, didn't you? That's not the first we've heard like that. Chiefs of police, there was a chief of police from Ontario who came here, I can't remember his name, who said the problem isn't the application of the law. The problem is the law itself. It's lax. It provides, it gives these light sentences to these guys. They get to go home. They get to go listen to the TV. And they are out on bail on ridiculous conditions. And I see people nodding there. I see you nodding your heads. So what do we need to change, Ms. Riendo? I'm sure you've heard stories like Ms. Tremblay's amongst the women you meet within your 46 shelters. Well, one of the things that has to happen is that every manifestation of violence has to be taken into account, any manifestation of control. And that's why we are urging that coercive control be criminalized. Because oftentimes police officers will say, well, I don't have the tools I need to be able to act. I realize things aren't working, but I can't use any tools. So if that coercive control could be taken into account, as it is taken into account in Great Britain, then we could better punish the behavior that women are subject to. And there also could be better risk assessment of what they're experiencing.
Much, MP Vieng. Next, MP Hepner, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony here today. I'll go quickly because we are short of time, and I'll start with you, Mr. Carollo. Thank you so much for your testimony. You know, the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, it's more than $500 million rolling out across the country. All provinces and territories signed on last year. And they have a lot of latitude in how they want to use that money, except 25% of it has to be for prevention. And to me, that's a lot of the work that you're doing. Could you talk about the impact and why we need to support those types of efforts?
Thank you so much for that question. Absolutely. And if we mean to prevent this violence from happening at its roots, we need to absolutely focus on early intervention, education, and engagement. We must absolutely focus on engaging directly with boys and young men, but also with men who are using violence. And that means intervening earlier in the process. And I need to share with you that laws and tools like that are not sufficient. We must work on helping men better address their conflict, their anger, their traumas, their own resentment, because men come out of these sentences, these conditions, these restrictions, and often they come out even more angry, even more resolved to enact revenge and use violence. And that is very problematic. It means that what we're trying to do to prevent the escalation of that violence is not working well. It's we need to do things differently. We need to work with those men in using different kinds of approaches. I would agree that a counseling session is not sufficient. A 12-week program for men who have used violence is not sufficient because we continue to see the escalation of femicides, the increase in these numbers, we need to look for better intervention and better approaches.
Agree. When you were talking about online radicalization, my brain went to Alec Manassian. I don't know if you know who that is, but I covered the Toronto van attack. This is a young man who was radicalized online. He told police at the beginning it was because he was an incel, but really through the course of that trial, we heard that really he was just radicalized online and he wanted to be part of the online group of mass murderers, and that's what happened. I also thought about the hashtag men going their own way. What does that sort of online, what does that mean to you?
So Alec Manassian, along with so many young men who've been recruited into these hateful ideological communities, are looking for community. They're looking for belonging. They're looking for support, but they're finding it in all the wrong ways. If we look at the social histories of Alec, of many young men like him, many adult men, if we look at those social histories, they indicate significant lack of support, of early intervention. These are young men who are looking for belonging, for community.
And young men. And sorry, just to nail that down, when you see a hashtag MGTOW, is that part of the problem?
It is part of the problem, and we need to address that. We need to create online spaces and better programs to help young men address their own needs and social needs so that they're not resorting to hateful ideologies and violence to address their own anger, their own exclusion, their own sense of not belonging anywhere.
Particularly concerning that the leader of the opposition is using a hashtag like this. But I'm going to move on. Alison Irons, you gave such an impassioned opening statement both this time and last time when you got cut off. But even before you got cut off, I started thinking coercive control. I don't think you had gotten there yet in your speech, but that's immediately where I went to, because in your daughter's case, even though there were no bruises, there were plenty of pieces of evidence to show that she could be in trouble. And yet, we've got coercive control implemented in other jurisdictions around the world. And from your testimony today, I'm hearing it's not a magic bullet. No. So what do we need to do with this coercive control legislation?
One of the things that I think is, and I'm speaking also as an ex-police officer, one of the things, I mentioned the education of the criminal justice system as being critical and comparing it to Kira's law, because if you have a judiciary and a crown and the police who don't understand that a woman has to be hit before they can do anything, that's going to be seriously problematic. I do recall, having been a police officer, the number of times that women would be told, well, I'm sorry, he hasn't hit you yet, so there's nothing we can do, frankly. Another thing that deeply worries me, and I'll try to take a minute, Chair, is that this is going to be a dual procedure offence. And one of the things that galls me no end about femicide right now is that by and large, the Crown charges second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. My own bias is that invariably that's because the guy said she made me do it, or I lost my temper, or I lost control, when in fact, as in my daughter's case, the Crown told me that had he lived, because it was a murder-suicide, it would have been first-degree murder according to the plan that they discovered he had. So I think there is a risk, again, if the Crown and judiciary or criminal justice system isn't well educated, that we'll see these all be summary convictions which carry a maximum of 6 months jail time.
It's an excellent point, and I've covered many court cases with the exact same thing. So we've got 3 recommendations from the National Police Federation that provinces and territories should commit more resources to collection and sharing of data, to create community bail enforcement monitoring. So if somebody doesn't act within your bail conditions, we know about it right away and police can act on it right away. And thirdly, that a justice of the peace actually has legal experience and the expertise to oversee these bail hearings, which we know they do.
concern when you mentioned data because, as you know, we have implemented Bill C-71, which required adult lifetime background checks for gun licensing. And I was in a meeting earlier in June with the RCMP and the National Firearms Program, and I have made the point repeatedly that if, in fact, the police are now conducting those adult lifetime background checks and denying or revoking licenses, their data should show an increase in the number of license refusals and revocations, and they can't even tell us that. And that's, 3 years after C-71 was implemented. So how we get that data, as you know, the collection of the data is a serious problem. Police and media are still not reporting on when a legal gun is used in a femicide or a homicide. So data is a key concern of mine, for sure.
Thank you. I would also like to remind, if we could kindly have the members and the witnesses speak through the chair as much as possible, just so that we're able to capture all of the voices for the translation and that for the analysts.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, next I would like to welcome Adrienne LaRouche. You have the floor for 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's truly impossible to understand that in 2024 there can be even one more victim. Now I'm going to begin with you, Ms. Tremblay. We have met before at this committee, and if my memory serves me well, we're always looking for concrete solutions or so that we can save women from these murders. Now, you raised the issue of e-bracelets, and you believe that this could be helpful. Now, there is a bill currently at the federal level, and in passing in Quebec, we have them, but now there's openness on the federal government side to be able to do this and to be able to monitor these people. Yes, I believe it was last November that I came before you. And there was S65, I believe it was, 205. It was S205 from Senator Boisvenu. And I think it's absolutely essential that an e-bracelet be available in all provinces throughout Canada, and that it also be available to Indigenous communities, because we had discussed this. You know, there was a whole issue of remote communities, but you know that could have really saved me earlier if he had had an e-bracelet. You know, at his last murder attempt, he broke in to my home. I wasn't able to flee. It was my neighbors, actually, who saved my life. And when I would walk anywhere, I was always looking around me. I was always checking. I had followed self-defense courses even. But even with that, you know, when you're dealing with a violent man, it's all very well to want to defend yourself. You know, I had a knife against my throat. So it's all very well to try and help yourself. You know, I hit him. I tried to get away. But if he had been wearing an e-bracelet, I would have been warned before he broke my door down. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, fortunately, I was able to get out because of my neighbors. But without that e-bracelet, there are many women who will die still. So that has to be understood, and it has to be done. And there's another thing I wanted to be able to say. I'll go quickly. I went to the courts to see what was happening, what judges were saying. And they were saying, well, you know, it's their first offense. And, well, perhaps. But women don't get second chances. So just because it's their first offense doesn't mean they shouldn't be wearing an e-bracelet. I'm sorry. You know, I suffered from domestic violence. There are women who have been beaten who have been under coercive control. They've been threatened. So it starts early on like that. It starts with the way the man behaves to be able to exercise that control. As Ms. Irons said, well, that's exactly what happened in my case. He finally acted, but there's some who act immediately from the outset. So what I'm saying is that an e-bracelet has to be issued, and judges have to understand why. And like I said earlier, we need to be able to meet with justices. So not just raise this in the court itself and end up hearing, well, we're going to give them a second chance. Well, do women get a second chance? No. As soon as you are violent, as soon as you have uttered threats, as soon as you have threatened to kill your partner, then that's it. You have to wear the e-bracelet. That's what should be said. So that will make that person think. Do you think people like wearing e-bracelets? No, they don't. But we don't like being imprisoned like this, and we want to be able to get out of our situation. Thank you, Ms. Tremblay. So what you're saying is that these e-bracelets should be used. And how would it be deployed on the ground, given the problems with connectivity in some areas? Well, anyway, thank you for your feedback. Now, I have one more question. I've also met with you before. You also have spoken about criminalizing coercive control. There's a bill. You referred to it, C-32. Have you had an opportunity to consider the bill? I mean, I assume you've had an opportunity to do that, but have you had an opportunity to think about what should follow on the bill? 30 seconds or less. Well, the bill has to be able to be applied fully, and therefore all those providers and stakeholders who are implementing it need to be trained, whether it's prosecutors or police officers. People have to understand its scope. They need to be able to understand the situations in which it applies. And that's why actually we looked at what had happened in Great Britain. There has to be training upstream.
Leah, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair. And I just want to start out by thanking all the witnesses today. Your testimony is so critical, but I also know for many in the room it's also very painful. And I want to acknowledge that, and I hope I honor what you've gifted us with today. With my questions. I wanted to start out, and I think with Madame Anderson-Pierce, you spoke about how this needs to be a nonpartisan issue. I agree with you. I think all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal, have all failed since time immemorial to deal with gender-based violence. This is nonpartisan, and every single political party is at fault for turning a blind eye on this violence, which is why this committee is so critical, women sitting together and Mark, to address this ongoing issue. You spoke about accountability, and I want to speak to that accountability. Call for Justice 1.7 says we call on the federal, provincial, and territorial governments in partnership with Indigenous peoples to establish a national Indigenous human rights ombudsperson with authority in all jurisdictions and to establish a national Indigenous and human rights tribunal. And then it goes on to talk about what the responsibility was. The federal government issued a report, I think it was last year, on how to put in place an ombudsperson position. Call for Justice 1.7. It's now November. We have another report, no action. How critical is it to get in place that ombudsperson's office right now? I'm saying right now. I'm saying it's that urgent, but I want to hear what you're saying.
I think it's very, very critical to have an accountability mechanism in place, because without an accountability mechanism, Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people are going to continue to die at alarming rates, go missing at alarming rates, and experience violence at alarming rates. So when we look at accountability mechanisms, if they're, I feel regardless of what government is in power, like as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, we've been experiencing violence for decades, including my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my mother, and myself as well. So I think, collectively, each and every one of you and all levels of government have to focus on establishing an accountability mechanism where we're going to see change in this country, where we're going to feel safe as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, where we're not constantly looking over our shoulder, wondering if we're going to be next, if we're going to go if we're going to go missing, if we're going to be murdered, if we're going to experience violence, and to really focus on addressing the systemic and structural racism that's deeply embedded in state policies and state practices as well. So it's urgently needed.
And I would also include in policing
Absolutely.
as well. Yes, absolutely. I have universal in the room agreement around policing, because we often talk about the end of the game. Like, I've heard a lot of stuff about tough on crime and bail reform, and that's a critical piece to make sure. But Madame Tremblay, Mr. Broadfoot, and Carollo, you spoke about the importance of education and re-socializing men into pro-social, anti-violent behavior, because by the time the police get involved, it's often too late. You spoke of your daughter, Miss Irons. By the time the police got involved, it was too late. I have a question for you after. But out of the three of you, and I have very limited time, why is education so important? It seems silly, but why is it critical to end gender-based violence? They say, oh, it's education, we need to get tough. But why is the education piece so critical? So I'll start with you, Madame Tremblay, and then I'll move to Mr. Broadfoot, and then to Mr. Carollo.
Apologies. Well, because that's where you have to start. This all starts when you're very young. In many cases, children who have witnessed violence will end up repeating that violent behavior. So if you do not put in place methods of preventing this, then it's only going to be repeated time and time again. And unfortunately, we are living in a violent world, and in school there is violence. Women themselves often have to defend themselves in schools. So I think there has to be a communication system of some sort. We have to have people who can intervene at an early stage, who can educate our children, tell them about respect of women, and that includes, and then that becomes a respect of their mother and their grandmother.
The other two can answer, and then I have a question for you around gun control. Thank you, Ms. Irons.
Thank you. The 5 and 6 minute rounds go very quickly. Okay, at this point, I'd like to welcome Anna. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. I was at an event yesterday called the Yellow Brick House, which was a walk for violence against women and children. One of the things that was continually spoken about was a brave young lady shared her story with us. And I will keep her anonymous because that's what she wanted us to do. And her story was of abuse by a repeat abuser, continually abusing. So 8 weeks before she was scheduled to be married, she decided that she can no longer stay in this relationship. So thank God for her strength. However, the abuser is still out there after being reported and arrested, and she is running scared. She's fearing for her life. So I'm going to ask Lucas to start with. Lucas, do you think that if we are going to protect women like your sister, that we need to ensure that the laws are strengthened so that criminals can be kept behind bars and women feel free to walk the streets?
Unfortunately, it appears as though we have lost Lucas online. So, Lucas, I'll just give it a few minutes here or seconds. Anna, if I can have you go on to another question, and then if he comes back on, and I'll excuse the last 20 seconds or so.
Thank you. So I'll go to Madame Tremblay. Do you agree that we need to strengthen the laws so that women aren't feared for their life?
Je pense sincèrement que oui.
Yes, I sincerely think so. Because as I was saying earlier, it's the women actually who are imprisoned right now. I've been to shelters. I've had to live in them. I've gone back several times, and thank God they were there. But, you know, when you have to leave these shelters, we're still followed. He knew where I was. He even sent someone into the shelter where I was to threaten me on his behalf. So there was another woman in there who had to give me the message. So if these men need to be kept behind bars, and they need to go through sessions, therapeutic sessions, so that they can become aware of their behavior, because there are some who aren't conscious of this behavior, and some will never change. However, and some men have to be kept in prison, because when they are released, then they start over again. I mean, it happened to me. And once this particular man in my case finished with me, he went on to do the same thing to other women. If he had stayed behind bars, that wouldn't have happened.
Thank you. One more question, because you spoke about this earlier, and we spoke about e-bracelets. So I want to talk about a situation that has occurred in my riding, where a retired firefighter was shot by MS-13 who crossed the border illegally. And he was arrested, and a bracelet was put on him. We just found out this weekend that the bracelet has been removed, and now the individual who, God pray for him every day because he has survived after being shot 7 times, is now fearing for his life because he was able to identify them. So I know the bracelet is a mechanism to ensure that they have control of where this individual is placed, but I don't think it's the only mechanism. I think we do need to keep them in jail until we can prove that they're not a risk to anyone else. So, Madame Tremblay, do you agree with that?
Entièrement d'accord.
Yes, I fully agree with that. There's no other way to ensure this. And if an e-bracelet has been taken off, I mean, we'll have to see what the defects are in these bracelets, but I would say that they absolutely have to be kept behind bars because there's no other way currently of protecting people against them. I don't know how these women will be able to be free to live their lives without keeping them behind bars. So that's where they have to be kept. But also give them the training, the education that they need.
We've got 20 seconds left. I want to ask quickly to any one of the witnesses that could respond. Why is it that we're always having to find shelters for women? Why is it that we can't incarcerate the criminals and leave the women and children in the home that they're accustomed to? Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have any time to respond, but perhaps you could find some room to respond in a different question. Emanuela, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Merci à tous nos témoins aujourd'hui.
Thank you to all our witnesses today.
Spoke about education being a key in finally putting an end to gender-based violence and to femicides. Some mentioned campaigns, others spoke about integrating it in our school programs and teaching kids at a young age what safe relationships are and how to treat each other, how to control their anger. Education, as you know, falls under provincial jurisdiction, but there are several things that the federal government can do in order to help implement these kinds of programs, or at least to ensure that the supports are there. Can you give us any recommendations, as I'm not allowed to give any recommendations for this report? Can you give us some recommendations as to how the federal government can support this initiative? That's for everybody who spoke to education being a key here.
I can offer a couple of comments on this, if I may. I think at a national level, it's really important that we work together with organizations like the Canadian Teachers Federation to better train and equip and support their members, educators across the country, to provide this type of foundational education, to start early, to educate early, because so much of this is fueled by the kinds of norms and socializations that we teach boys and young men from a very early age to always be in control, to always fight back, to stand the ground, to not accept any emotions other than anger, but rather to accept a full range of emotions, to seek help when needed, rather than keeping it on, to ask for help. And because without those kinds of early skills, boys and young men end up growing up not knowing how to deal with their feelings of loss, of rejection, of anger, and end up using violence instead.
I appreciate that. Madame Trou? Oui, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, in Quebec, there are shelters that actually go into primary and high schools in order to raise awareness. So I think there would be a possibility to have specialized services and target them. And of course, there has to be permanent funding, and it has to be sufficient, because we cannot respond to the requests that are coming from schools currently. And we know that teachers are already overburdened in their daily lives with the work they have to do. So there have to be adequate resources, and these resources have to be specialized resources so that young people can participate in workshops as early as possible. Thank you very much. I have a second question. Mathilde and Louise. You spoke about these shelters, and you said that one of the issues is that women don't have access to affordable housing when they get to the second stage. The federal government is doing a lot currently to build new buildings and convert some buildings. Oftentimes when government has a role to play, well, there's a 30% of it that has to be affordable. So 30% of that construction is for affordable housing in any construction. So I'd like to know if you think any percentage of those new builds should be dedicated to women who are survivors of domestic violence. Ms. Riendo. Well, beyond reserving spaces for women who are victims of domestic violence, the delivery of this social housing has to be accelerated because they need access to affordable and safe housing. So I think that's one part of the answer. And yes, we could look at how we can make sure that women have access to this housing. But there has to be more now. That would help solve the problem, because the wait lists are very, very long for social and affordable housing.
Okay, ben, je vois que j'ai moins de...
I see that I have less than 20 seconds left. So I'll give up my time, and thank you to all the witnesses for having come today.
To have you, I know that it's traumatizing and re-traumatizing for some, so we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Emanuela. Next, Adrienne, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did have other questions to ask, but I'd like to come back to this issue of housing. It's not the first time that I've been told that emergency spots, unfortunately, are not freed up within shelters because women can't move on to that second stage. They can't get out of that cycle, and they're afraid of ending up on the streets. So I can think of two examples, actually. During the pandemic, I had discussions with the Minister of Public Safety in Quebec, and funding had been promised for shelters. Ms. Riendo, I think there were investments that were announced on the part of the federal government as well. However, it had to go through Quebec, and it took 6 months longer to get these funds out. Ms. Riendo, is there anything you'd like to say about that? During the pandemic, there were emergency situations, and it took 6 months longer for the federal government to give money to Quebec. Well, yes, there are situations where one has to act quickly, and unfortunately, oftentimes there are federal-provincial negotiations that are long and drawn out and difficult before the funding is delivered directly to the people who need it. So I would call on all parties, actually, to make sure that these services can be provided to women and children, and that the process can be better. We are talking about the security of women and children that is threatened.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Riendo. I'll move on to Ms. Cooper. You wrapped up earlier by saying that action has to be taken right now. So in under 30 seconds, could you give us one or two of the most important or urgent actions that need to be taken?
Implement MIWG recommendations.
Okay, thank you. At this point, Leah, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Did Lucas, was he able to rejoin?
Unfortunately, not at this point, no.
Okay. And understanding that this is very difficult topic, I wanted to ask you, Madame Arons, because, you know, of your sharing of what happened to your daughter. The Canadian Women's Foundation stated that the presence of firearms is the single greatest risk factor in the lethality of domestic violence. Rural women are particularly vulnerable to homicide by firearms. Saskatchewan reported the highest rate of firearm-related homicides in 2016, and Alberta experienced the second highest rate. Shotguns and rifles commonly kept in rural homes have been recorded to as the weapon of choice when it comes to domestic violence by the Canadian Association of Police Chiefs. In violent homes, they have been used to intimidate and control women in rural areas. We've had this ongoing debate in the House of Commons around gun control. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I'm very grateful to the government for the two bills that it has passed. The concern remains. Bill C-21 is still, of course, in implementation. And from a meeting I attended with Public Safety, their emphasis right now with that bill is to try and work on all the pieces of the bill concurrently. But my point to them was that we just had the terrible killing in Sault Ste. Marie last October. And we just had one in Harrow that involved a legal shotgun again. So I asked them in that meeting, of all the priorities they're working on simultaneously, can they not make a greater priority out of the safety of women and children? I personally am perceiving right now an increase in the number of children that are whose lives are also being taken with their mother's lives. So I'm very concerned about it. It's a myth that legal gun owners don't kill. For example, in terms of femicide, Lépine, of course, at Polytechnique, École Polytechnique is the most famous one of all, but also Jones, Desmond, Finn, Pearson, Walsh, I believe Soderhuisen, Quinnell. Legal gun owners who committed other crimes include Bissonnette, Lapa, Mercier, Britton, Schmigelski and McLeod, Raymond, Fabricant, Gill, Bourque. I could go on. So those bills are very necessary because it's not only criminals who kill. However, what concerns me, as I've said before, I'm not confident in speaking with the RCMP and the National Firearms Centre that those bills have yet been well implemented or that we have any data to show that they have. I don't have a lot of confidence yet that they're actually applying the law as it relates to Bill C-71 for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. At this point, MP Doncho has the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to all the witnesses for being here today. It was a challenging testimony to hear, and I know this committee in particular hears a lot of very difficult topics and heartfelt stories and real traumas. And so I just would like to thank you for your courage of being here in the first place and of sharing your stories, and I think it will have a very much lasting impact on members of this committee, certainly speaking for myself. So thank you very much for your raw testimony. It's deeply helpful as policymakers to hear what you've experienced and how you feel laws should be changed and funding should be molded in a way that would prevent many of the deaths of, or may prevent many of the deaths of the loved ones that many of you have shared their stories today. So thank you again for your courage. Miss Irons, I did want to ask you about one of in your opening comments, and I'm deeply sorry about the loss of your daughter. Thank you for sharing her story. You mentioned that her killer had not been physically violent, but had been otherwise violent, verbally using coercive control. Is that correct? And so was there anything that the law, where was the shortcomings in the legislation that could have provided some sort of roadblock? I mean, from what I understand of the way a lot of intimate partner violence laws are written, that you have to be physically violent to get an electronic monitoring bracelet, for example. Are there other shortcomings? And with your knowledge of the laws and RCMP officer, can you speak to where those holes are that the law could have better supported the protection of your daughter from this man?
Well, one change has taken place, although it's not yet implemented, so that, for example, I mentioned my fear coming out of my policing career of getting my daughter a restraining order. Under Bill C-21, there is a new provision in the law that says if an abuser or harasser of a woman, or it could be a male in some cases, gets a restraining order, the chief firearms officer will be compelled by the court to do a search to see if that person has a license or any guns, and the guns will be immediately forfeited or turned in. The problem is, as I said, with public safety, they're still working on all these concurrent priorities, so women may think that piece has been implemented when, in fact, it's not yet in place. And the good part about that, the red flag laws under C-21 are for a very limited time. They're only for 30 days. They're emergency risk orders, so they're very short, whereas with a restraining order now, once it's implemented, it will be the gun license suspension and the revocation of the guns will be for the duration of the restraining order, which could be as much as 2 years. With my daughter, the only other thing, and as I mentioned, she was very reluctant to disclose the suicide threats. She finally did confide in me about one, and to my dying day, I will regret that I didn't overrule my daughter. But I told her we either had to call his parents or call the OPP. At that point, I'd just had it. And my daughter was terrified because she said he'll then get his guns seized, which would have happened. But he could apply to get them back. He can appeal to get them back after 30 days. And secondly, he could get an illegal gun anywhere else. But as I said in Public Safety Committee before, in the case of his legal guns that he owned, the law didn't have to make it easy for him to get those.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Irons, and certainly Ms. Demoff actually and I worked on Bill C-21, and there was a lot of good discussion around those red and yellow flag laws. I appreciate your feedback on them. One aspect I did want to mention, it sounds like recently a bill passed called Bill S-205, and actually Ms. Tremblay came to committee about, I'll just let you get your piece in. Thank you. For the two of you, this question, S-205 recently passed in the House of Commons with quite a bit of support. But one issue of that bill that I found concerning was my bill I supported from a senator who initiated it, so it was a good effort there. But that bill was supposed to provide options to get electronic monitoring bracelets for all the sort of precursors to domestic violence that didn't include, in addition to the physical violence, so things like intimidation, break-and-enters, things that judges don't necessarily think, oh, this is a precursor to domestic violence. Unfortunately, that was
gutted from the bill at this committee, unfortunately, so it weakened the stretch of that bill. Do you feel that those precursors like intimidation, break-and-enters, that those should be considered precursors to domestic violence in the eyes of a judge, and also that electronic monitoring devices should perhaps be put on when it's something like intimidation is found to be the offense? Perhaps Ms. Tremblay, and in brief, Ms. Irons.
Tout à fait.
Absolutely. 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 And it's so unfortunate that that was withdrawn. Do you know, when we come here to speak to you and make suggestions, I understand that you need to discuss it amongst yourselves. But if you knew all the work, all the attention that is paid to this, all the research that has been done, when these proposals come forward, it's because it's something we need. So yes, absolutely. As soon as any actions are taken that are violent, words, actions, then that e-bracelet has to be imposed. It has to be mandatory. Do you know, these kinds of things happened to me. He knocked down my door. Well, a police officer could have come immediately to put that on him had it been in place. And what I was saying earlier as well is that there must be a way for women to be able to wear something that she can activate as soon as something happens, so that police officers can be there right away. So if both were to be in place, then that might help and assist women to get out of that situation. So there's the e-bracelet, there's that little panic button that like the one that I wore, actually.
The floor for 5 minutes.
Excusez-moi, est-ce que je peux ajouter quelque...
I'm sorry, could I just add one thing? And perhaps this could be proposed, and it would be free for women. That panic button, that should also be there, so that when they go to the court, for example, they have access right away to a panic button.
Merci.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. I'm really sorry that we lost Lucas. And if he's watching, or if he does watch this later, I just want you to know that your sister continues to be the biggest and most colorful flower because of your advocacy. And I understand that her heart continues to beat because your family made the choice to be organ donors. So, sorry to all of you who have come here to share your stories. I think you are so brave. I've heard Lindsay's story many times, and she should be here with us right now, as should your sister, Lucas. I don't know if you know that Keir's law also included a provision for judges to order electronic monitoring for people accused of intimate partner violence. That didn't get as much attention as the judicial education piece. One of the challenges with Keir's law is that it educates federal judges, and we're seeing provincially appointed justices of the peace that don't have legal training, particularly in Ontario. How, and maybe I'll start with you, Diane and Allison, how important is that education provincially to make sure that police services and provincially appointed judges have education around intimate partner violence and coercive control?
May I? We've just recently learned in the last couple of weeks that despite over 100 municipalities in Ontario having declared intimate partner violence an emergency, the province chose to withdraw the bill that the NDP had put forward. So I feel in Ontario right now there is a bias in terms of appointments of judges and so forth that are going to be supportive of this kind of legislation. I always worry that our judges are still, to the extent that I'm aware of, still largely male in this country. We don't know how many of them are actually abusers. So I think the education is essential. There is really no way to police judges. They police themselves. So I think we've got to at least make those strides to attempt it, but I'm not highly confident.
I have really limited time. Allison, I just quickly wanted to ask you, because I know you have tracked femicides to see as much as you can, because we don't do it, or police services don't do it, to see how many are legal firearms owners. I'm just wondering, you went through some names, but how many, I know you track that yourself, God bless you. Can you maybe share with us what you've found?
I'm thinking of the list that I have, and okay, there. Sorry. Red button. Again, it's often in the rural homes, as you say. My daughter's ex was from a rural area, and she was deemed a rural victim because she was living in Bracebridge at the time. But in many of these cases, for example, in the case of Jones in Berks Falls, Ontario, who killed a woman, her mother, elderly mother, and her adult son, Ulla Thiorat had gone to the police because she alleged that her neighbor Jones had committed a sexual assault against her. I don't know what became of that, but in fact, he then went. Because she rejected his advances, he went to her home, murdered her elderly mother, and her adult son before shooting himself. So another area that we've been working on extensively is on how police use what we call the FIP-HIT codes, or the codes that police can use. Somebody mentioned other types of coercive control earlier. When they attend an occurrence, whether it's a break and enter or some kind of assault or harassment, there are actually over 400 codes that police can use to code an occurrence report that will trigger a firearms review. Again, the problem is, and I was told by a confidential source of mine, being an ex-police officer, that a lot of police officers and police forces either don't use them or don't know how to use them. And so once again, we're missing opportunities to code and capture these offenses and perhaps prevent a tragedy. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
This is just a really quick question for you, Allison. Should Bill C-71 and Bill C-21 be repealed?
Absolutely not. We worked very, very hard. In fact, my issue with Bill C-71 and what I advocated so hard for was the background checks. In my daughter's case, it turned out through my own investigation after her murder that he had, in his past, some many years before he met her, he had been convicted of forcible confinement and assault related to a drug trafficking transaction with another male. And yet, as soon as his parents had money for lawyers, so he was able to plea bargain his offenses down. He got 2 years probation, and as soon as he got off probation, he applied for and got a gun license, which is just ludicrous. And that's why Bill C-71 changed the 5-year requirement for a firearms review of any criminal history to an adult lifetime history. But again, I'm not sure that they're actually doing anything with that yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, MP Damoff. At this point, that does conclude our panel for today. And on behalf of committee, I would certainly like to provide a heartfelt thank you to all of the witnesses, both here in the room and online, for being with us and sharing your stories and your recommendations. Just to be mindful, I would encourage any witnesses, if you did not get an opportunity to answer a question that was posed of you and you would like to submit a question that you didn't have an opportunity to answer, please feel free to send it to the committee. Be most welcome. Other than that, is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting for today? Meeting adjourned. Right.